Hi, my name is Katie, and this is Yapping About History, a podcast where we yap about the past so that the present makes more sense. I'm sure we're all more aware of Aaron Burr thanks to the Hamilton musical. We know that he practiced law with his frenemy Alexander Hamilton, won Philip Schuyler's old Senate seat, kept his plans close to his chest, and tended to wait for it. But the musical ends with, spoiler alert, Aaron Burr killing Hamilton in a duel, while Burr was the Vice President of the United States of America. So we don't really get to know what he was waiting for, and that's what we're going to talk about on today's episode, the Aaron Burr Conspiracy, which is when he basically tried to start his own country. Yup. So let's get into it. For those of you who haven't watched the Hamilton musical or listened to the soundtrack, as much as I'd like to perform a one-woman show for you right now, I'm not going to torture you like that. But we will get into Aaron Burr's backstory a little bit. He was born in Newark, New Jersey on February 6, 1756. He was privately educated and then went to the College of New Jersey, which is now known as Princeton. He was supposed to follow in his grandfather's footsteps and go into the ministry, so he began studying theology, but eventually he switches to law and enrolls in Litchfield Law School, the second formal law school established in the U.S. He joins the American Revolution, fighting for the Continental Army. In 1779, he resigns his commission due to his declining health caused by exhaustion and the rigors of war, which, I mean, sounds like everyone who would fight in a war would have that, but he's accepted to the bar at Albany in 1782 and starts practicing law in New York City with Hamilton after the British were evacuated. They famously are co-counsel for a defendant in the U.S.'s first murder trial. It's an interesting case, and if you want to hear more about it, the podcast Buried Bones does a two-part episode on it called Woman in the Well from March of 2023. He goes on to be a representative in the New York Assembly in 1784, then becomes the New York Attorney General from 1789 to 1791, and from there he is elected to the U.S. Senate, where he serves for 6 years. He's offered a seat on the New York Supreme Court of Judicature, not sure if I'm saying that right, but he declines. After his Senate term, he goes back to the New York Assembly and serves 2 more non-consecutive terms. In 1794, his wife Theodosia dies of cancer. She was a really fascinating person, and she deserves her own episode, which we'll definitely get to. Then he runs for president in 1800 against Thomas Jefferson, and if you watched Hamilton, you know what happens, but they both get the same number of electoral votes, so it goes to the House of Representatives for them to decide who will be president. They decide on Thomas Jefferson, and back then the runner-up automatically became the vice president, so that's how Burr becomes Jefferson's VP. And Jefferson does go on to champion the 12th Amendment, which changes how the VP is chosen, and that's ratified in 1804. And then the beginning of the end occurs when someone at a dinner party with Hamilton writes letters saying what Hamilton said about Burr. In a very gossipy situation, the letters say that Hamilton said that Burr was a dangerous man and ought to not be trusted with the reins of government. And Hamilton's words are pretty prophetic, as we will see in a bit. The letters get published in the Albany Register, and Burr demands a retraction, which Hamilton refuses to do. Things escalate until we find ourselves in Weehawken, New Jersey. Everything is legal in New Jersey. On the early morning of July 11th, 1804, where Hamilton and Burr duel about it, and Burr ends up killing Hamilton. Mind you, like we said in the intro, he is the current vice president of the U.S. He flees to Washington, D.C. and completes his term as vice president. Wild times. All right, so now that we've got the lowdown on what Aaron Burr's been up to as of 1804, let's get into the conspiracy. A lot of the details about it have been lost to history, but it probably started in early 1804, months before Burr would end up killing Hamilton in the duel. It seemed like his political future was fading in the DC, New York City circles, and after the duel, it was completely gone, and he thought he could revive it out in the West. His plan? To take a small but well-armed military force and capture land from the Louisiana Territory and maybe even from Mexico. At this time, the land was mostly unsettled, and that is by white people, and its borders were disputed by Spain. And the white people who were out there were very disillusioned with the US government and openly called for secession. So Burr was like, how hard could it be? His main co-conspirator was a man he had become friends with during the Revolution named General James Wilkinson, the commander-in-chief of the US Army. Wilkinson was described as arrogant, unscrupulous, and an alcoholic. And in a move that I'm guessing is the reason historians believe the conspiracy was brewing in Burr's mind before the duel, was that as vice president, he had convinced Jefferson to name Wilkinson as governor of the northern Louisiana area. This way, Wilkinson would control the army there, and it wouldn't be suspicious for him to be moving around out in the West. Then Burr also gets in contact with Britain's minister to the U.S., a man named Anthony Merry. He offered to help Britain take the Western Territory from the U.S. in return for money and ships so that he could do it. Merry immediately writes back to Britain being like, yo, the fucking vice president of the United States is down to help us get some Western land. So what do we want to do about it? When Burr's VP term ended in April of 1805, Burr heads out west to do some reconnaissance and starts dropping hints in every town he visits about his future expeditions. And this is when he meets who would end up becoming his most loyal follower, Harmon Blennerhassett. Blennerhassett was an eccentric Irishman who, unlike a lot of his fellow Irish immigrants, actually came to the U.S. with a small fortune. He built a huge mansion on an island in the Ohio River near the border between Ohio and West Virginia. Burr continues to travel all over the Western lands and drops down into New Orleans before heading back to D.C. He had picked up some more supporters along the way, including a U.S. Senator named Jonathan Dayton and a group called the Mexico Society, which was a group of New Orleans businessmen who favored annexation of Mexican territory. Despite gaining some momentum and support, Burr still faced many challenges, the chief amongst them being that he never hears back from Britain or Spain. And then rumors about what he's up to start getting published in Eastern newspapers, but Burr still has his heart set on taking the Western Territory for himself. But then he got some good news when the border dispute with Spain started to heat up and Jefferson ordered Wilkinson to Louisiana with U.S. troops. The idea was that Burr and Wilkinson would attack Texas or other parts of Mexico under the guise of doing it on behalf of the U.S., but once they seize the land, Burr would claim it for himself. As the plan starts to shape up, Burr sends a coded letter to Wilkinson, which would later be known as the Cipher Letter, and then he sets out for Blennerhassett's mansion and asks him to outfit his island as a military encampment. While Burr is waiting, he's traveling around through Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and this is when the rumors of what he's up to start to become very overwhelming. So much so that Burr is actually called into court 3 separate times for charges of treason, but each time he was acquitted. And they're like, you're good, man. Even though Burr may have had an unrealistic belief that the plan could still work, the people he had recruited could clearly see the writing on the wall. In December of 1806, Wilkinson decides to save his own butt and sends a letter to Jefferson outlining the conspiracy without explicitly naming Burr. In his mind, he was probably, well, like, I didn't really snitch since I didn't name names, but it didn't really matter because Burr's name was all over the newspapers in regards to these treasonous plans. On December 9th, U.S. militiamen capture most of Burr's boats and supplies that he'd been collecting at a Marietta, Ohio boatyard. And yes, it seemed to be real, like he was actually making headway on his plans. But a few days later, the militia also raids Blennerhassett's island and ransack the mansion. But by then, most of the men that were waiting there had already fled down the Ohio River. But to Blennerhassett's credit, he follows through on his promise and meets Burr with all of the men who were still willing to go for it down further on the Ohio River. Burr wasn't aware of the raid, so he was pretty much expecting a small army to show up, but in the end, he only gets about 100 men, and still Burr is like, let's do it, figuring that he can grab more recruits as they go on down the Mississippi River. When they reach a place called Bayou Pierre, around 30 miles outside of New Orleans, one of the men hand Burr a newspaper that says that there's a reward for anyone who captures him, and his coded letter to Wilkinson has also been printed fully decoded. Burr has at least enough sense to kind of admit that the whole idea is over, and he turns himself in. And he was arraigned before a grand jury. He was able to convince that jury, though, that he and his men had no intention of attacking a U.S. territory, and the jury failed to return that indictment. One of the 2 judges involved in the case still felt like something was a little bit off, so he asked Burr to return to court the next day. Burr, figuring his luck had run out, decides to flee into the wilderness, where he was eventually captured on February 13th, 1807, and the accounts all say that he pretty much just looked like shit, like he had been living in the wild exiled for that amount of time. He was taken to federal court in Richmond, Virginia to face trial for treason. His case was one of the trials of the century and one of the first to really test the treason clause of the new U.S. Constitution. The clause reads as follows in Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, quote, "Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. The Congress shall have power to declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted." End quote. The treason clause was created using the English statute of treason as an example, and it put a high burden of proof because you needed 2 witnesses to the actual overt act, and it also limited Congress's ability to define treason themselves. Although there had been around 30 treason cases by the time Burr's came about, his was still considered a landmark case. And what I think is really interesting is that it involved a lot of the dudes who were involved in actually writing the Constitution. Working on Burr's treason defense team in 1807 were Edmund Randolph and Luther Martin. Those were both former constitutional delegates. And then President Thomas Jefferson directed the prosecution from the White House with George Hay and future Attorney General William Wirt. Ken Neumeyer, the author of the book The Treason Trial of Aaron Burr, Law, Politics, and the Character Wars of the New Nation, said, quote, "In Jefferson's morally dichotomous calculus, Burr was a danger to the Republic. In Jefferson's personalized view of the presidency, it was his responsibility to eliminate the danger, even if it meant breaking the law. Burr brought out the worst in Jefferson, and Jefferson brought out the worst in Burr," end quote. And it kind of seems like Burr had that effect on those he worked with. Remember, Burr was Jefferson's VP at the time that this is all happening. So it's crazy that the president is effectively prosecuting his own VP, kind of from afar. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, was the judge for the trial because he was also the federal judge for the U.S. Circuit Court for Virginia. Marshall was another one of Jefferson's political enemies, and interestingly, also a distant cousin of his. In an unusual move, Marshall subpoenaed Jefferson to deliver documents that Burr had requested in order to prepare his defense. However, Jefferson only supplied parts of the letters and never formally acknowledged the subpoena. The case was looking good for Burr because testimony said that Burr was 100 miles away from Blennerhassett's Island, the one location when and where the government claimed Burr was planning this overt act of treason. The jury quickly reached its verdict and found Burr not guilty. Of course, this pisses off Jefferson. Another episode where Thomas Jefferson's pissed off might be a trend here. He tries to get the House of Reps to then bring impeachment charges against Judge Marshall, but that doesn't pan out. And not surprisingly, he had also tried to do the same thing to another Supreme Court justice, a man named Samuel Chase, a couple years before this. Chase was a Federalist, which was the opposing party to Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, and Chase would often use his position to give partisan speeches and to berate the Jefferson administration in public. At that time, the House did approve 8 articles of impeachment, but he was acquitted in the Senate. This ordeal was really important, and it solidified the independence of the judicial branch. Even though Burr won in court, the public was not a fan of his. He was burned in effigy all across the U.S., and several other states tried to bring charges against him. And in one of his wiser choices during this time, he flees to Europe. But instead of laying low or trying to, maybe start a new life, start over, want to guess what he does? He continues to try and convince Britain and France to support another North American invasion scheme. And I'm just like, brother, just give it up already. It feels like he was really channeling his inner Hamilton in his obstinate refusal to let it go. And then in 1812, after 4 years in exile and the U.S. on the brink of war with Britain, he figures that no one's really going to care anymore about his past treasonous ways or, the fact that he killed Alexander Hamilton. And for the most part, they kind of do forget about it because he moves back to New York City and practices law and lives the rest of his life in relative obscurity for the most part. However, in 1833, he remarried to a woman named Eliza Jumel. He was 77 and she was 58. Her first husband, a wealthy French merchant, had died only 14 months earlier. She's also another fascinating character. She grew up in a brothel with her sister and mom after her parents' marriage fell apart and her mom had nowhere else to go. When the brothel was shut down, Eliza was then put into indentured servitude, but later she made a name for herself as a madam and was able to get a little bit of money. With that money, she moved to New York City and changed her name to leave her old life behind and start a new one. That's when she married her first husband and rose to the upper middle class, although they could really never break into the New York elite circles. They spent some time in France, but things were getting turbulent over there, so her husband, Stephen, put all of their New York properties in a trust for Eliza, which meant that they would be hers for life. She became even wealthier when her husband died, and she collected on his debts and even fought his brother and sister to keep as much of the money as possible. She was an extremely savvy businesswoman and very charming, and it seems her only mistake was getting married to Aaron Burr. Although it was definitely a marriage of convenience, because Burr was born into the American elite, which was the one circle that Eliza had never been able to get into, and having his last name, even though it was pretty tarnished at the time, it still gave her access to those elite circles. Even at 77, Burr was still an excellent lawyer and was said to be very charming, but he was a chronic debtor. He was constantly spending borrowed money and borrowing some more, and this habit didn't change once they were married. Once he got his hands on Eliza's money, he started going through it like crazy. So much so that Eliza kicks him out only after a few months of being married and then files for divorce a year after. The only grounds for divorce in New York at this time was infidelity, so Eliza had one of her servants testify that they had seen Burr with another woman shortly after their marriage. Burr countered his own made-up stories that Eliza was cheating on him with 8 different men because, get this, the divorce would not be awarded if the complainant was also committing infidelity, which makes total sense. My favorite part of the story is that Eliza hired Alexander Hamilton Jr. to represent her in this case. So Burr was going up against the son of the man that he had killed a couple of decades ago. And I just really love how petty Eliza was with this. Eliza wins her case, and Burr ends up spending around $13,000 in the first few months of their marriage, which is the equivalent to around $470,000 today. And this doesn't include her lawyer fees. And when she died in 1865, she was worth at least $1 million, which is around $20 million today. She was very popular in her time and one of, if not the wealthiest women in New York City at the time. She was so popular that the New York Times wrote a 3,000-word obituary about her, and her life took on legendary status, with the Times saying she attended Washington's inauguration, that Ben Franklin called her his fairy queen, and that she charmed the likes of Thomas Jefferson, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Patrick Henry. This is most likely not true, but I think it does speak to her charm and her status. But despite all that, she really did fall out of history, so I just wanted to give her a little moment in this episode to tell you about her. And speaking of women in Burr's life who don't get enough airtime, I want to end the episode with a little bonus conspiracy about his only child, Theodosia, which he had with his first wife, also named Theodosia. Theodosia, the daughter, died in a shipwreck at sea in 1812. However, there are several conspiracies surrounding her death and what actually happened, so I thought we'd briefly go over them since, this is a conspiracy episode. She was married to the South Carolina governor, a man named Joseph Alston, and on December 31st, 1812, she took a small schooner called the Patriot to New York from South Carolina to visit her dad. It was expected to take 6 days, but when the Patriot didn't show up to New York after a few weeks, both Burr and Joseph assumed that the boat went down in a winter storm, although there would never be proof of this. Historians have documented a winter storm off North Carolina coast in January of 1813, yet ships' logs from vessels patrolling those waters at that time do not record the Patriot being stopped by the British Royal Navy or having sunk. Over the next few decades, wild stories about what happened to the Patriot began to spread in the newspapers. There were supposed deathbed confessions from pirates who said they stopped the Patriot and forced all of the passengers to walk the plank. A couple of them even claimed to have murdered Theodosia specifically. Other stories claim that she was taken prisoner by the pirates and that's how she lived out the rest of her life. And while even other stories say that the pirates sold her into slavery. But things get weird in 1869 when a North Carolina doctor named William Pohl treats a woman who is vacationing in a town called Nag's Head. The only thing she had to pay him with was a portrait of a young woman that her first husband had taken from a shipwreck during the War of 1812. Dr. Pohl claimed that the portrait was of Theodosia, but again, he knew all about this disappearance and who she was, so he could have been trying to get his 15 minutes of fame. My favorite legend is the one of the female stranger of Alexandria. It's such a weird story, and there's several podcasts that go more into it, like the Stuff You Missed in History class, if you want to check that out. The legend goes that in 1860, a couple arrived in Alexandria, Virginia by ship and rented a room at the Gatsby's Tavern. The woman was really sick, and historically Theodosia did have a history of illnesses after the birth of her son, and the husband of this ill woman hired a doctor to help care for her, but only if the doctor accepted the conditions that he asked no questions about either the husband or the wife's identities. The woman's health gets worse, and she ends up dying on October 14th, 1816. Her husband borrowed money from a local businessman to bury her in town, repaying him with a note from the Bank of England, which later turns out to be a forgery. And then he basically pieces out. And you can still see her grave at the St. Paul's Episcopal Church Cemetery. Her tombstone says, quote, "To the memory of a female stranger whose mortal sufferings terminated on the 14th day of October, 1816, aged 23 years and 8 months. This stone was placed here by her disconsolate husband, in whose arms she sighed out her latest breath, and who under God did his utmost even to soothe the cold dead ear of death," end quote. And of course, with such an odd and sudden appearance and then death in town, rumors and speculation of who this woman could have been quickly start to spread. And one of those theories is that it was Theodosia Burr Alston. Although I couldn't really find any explanations about why she would hide her identity or anything more to the legend other than people were just speculating it was her. Plus, the dates don't really match up unless she really was trying to fake her own death and start over with a new identity or something. Yeah, so there are some conspiracies about the women in Burr's life and how Aaron Burr once tried to start his own country. That's all I have for you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Yappin' About History. I hope this episode is a reminder that what we do today will shape the stories that are told tomorrow. History isn't just something we remember, it's something we carry with us. Bye.